Okay, let's talk about the neuroanatomy of motivation and reinforcement. Where does the majority of drug reinforcement happen in the brain? Okay. So, excuse me, reinforcement is associated with the limbic system. Okay. What does the limbic system do? The limbic system, as this slide implies, is involved with motivation and reinforcement. There are generally 4 F's that we associate with the limbic system: food, fight, flight, and friskiness or fornication are things that are related to processes associated with the limbic system. Okay, when is the limbic system activated, so to speak? Okay, the limbic system becomes activated whenever there's an imbalance in the system. So when we think about behaviors that involve motivation, reinforcement, so forth, the system is activated when there is an imbalance. So in terms of food, if the organism is low on nutrients, if the organism needs water, or water balance in the body needs to be restored, then these messages are going to reach the brain and activate the limbic system. So the limbic system is activated whenever there's an imbalance in the system. Okay, and then probably, as you have picked up on by now, excuse me, some things we oversimplify for the purposes of this course and for the level of understanding that we need to have for this course. So in terms of the sensory input, the sources of sensory input into the limbic system, those are primarily internal. Okay, internal sensory input, internal sensory input includes those homeostatic mechanisms, things that regulate things like thirst, hunger, hormone levels that might affect when it's time to mate, things like that. Okay, so internal homeostatic mechanisms are one source of sensory input, and then of course the other source of sensory input is external. Okay, that could come from other brain regions or stimuli that are actually external to the organism. Okay, so 2 sources of sensory input: those that are internal, represented by homeostatic mechanisms; those that are external, representing input from other brain regions and input from the environment as well. Okay, this is just a slide that shows you a little bit about the limbic system. The limbic system is made up of a number of different brain regions. For our purposes and over the course of the semester, you see that most of our discussions are going to focus on the nucleus accumbens and also the VTA, or ventral tegmental area. These are the areas that are very, very important in terms of the rewarding or reinforcing properties of drugs. Okay, so you see part of what is represented on this slide over here, sensory input, this is representing external stimuli that might affect another brain region that ultimately influences the limbic system. And then in terms of homeostatic input, when the organism is thirsty or hungry, those represent imbalances and the limbic system would be then activated. Okay, you'll see that some of the brain regions that are included in the limbic system, other than the nucleus accumbens, the VTA, include the hippocampus, which is involved in learning and memory, the amygdala, which is involved in emotion and emotion regulation, and we have the cortex, which is involved in integrating sensory information. So of course, if an organism is thirsty or hungry, we've got to remember the last place that we found food, and then our motor system gets incorporated because we have to actually locomote or move to that location where we last found food. And so interactions between the limbic system, the components of the limbic system and other brain regions are quite important. Okay, but again, our discussions over the course of the semester are primarily going to focus on the nucleus accumbens. Okay, And then the ventral tegmental area is also important as it provides input into the nucleus accumbens. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the role of pleasure in reinforcement. What role does pleasure have in reinforcement? So, of course, if an organism performs an action, and if that results in something pleasurable, then the organism is more likely to repeat that action at some point. Okay? But what I want to make sure you understand here is that pleasure is subjective. What is considered pleasurable to one organism may not be pleasurable to another, and we'll address that again. So what are the pleasure centers? These are the areas of the brain that when activated, individuals report feeling quote-unquote pleasure. Again, pleasure centers are the areas of the brain that when activated, individuals report feeling pleasure. So how would you do that? You can hook up electrodes to a person's scalp, and then you could provide stimulation through those electrodes. And, depending on where the electrodes are placed, there may be areas where that stimulation creates a pleasurable experience for the individual. And so, again, pleasure centers are the areas of the brain that when activated, individuals report feeling pleasure. Okay, so we want to address the idea of what about reinforcement without the sensation of pleasure. So let me give you an example. So remember we talked about the fact that the limbic system is activated whenever there's an imbalance in the system. Okay, so take for example an individual that's thirsty. Let's say that I'm thirsty. Okay, now when I'm thirsty, I usually seek out some water to drink. Okay, when I drink the water, it corrects the imbalance in the system. Okay, so I know that when I'm thirsty, I need to seek water. Okay, so that behavior is performed again in all the instances when I'm thirsty. Okay, but I don't necessarily report feeling pleasure when I drink water. Okay, why are we pointing this out? Because pleasure is not necessary for behavior to be repeated. What is necessary is activation of the limbic system. Okay, so when I'm thirsty, the limbic system, lets me know that there's an imbalance. I seek out water and I drink the water, which corrects the imbalance. Okay, so my limbic system is involved there. So the next time that I'm thirsty, I seek out water. Doesn't mean that drinking the water was quote-unquote pleasurable. Now, if you're doing something and pleasure happens to be involved, that's an added bonus. But we want to make sure that we understand that pleasure is not an absolute requirement for behavior to be repeated. The only thing that's necessary for the behavior to be repeated is activation of the limbic system. So sometimes we call the limbic system the do-it-again system. Okay, because when that system gets activated, a behavior, whatever behavior activated that system, is more likely to be repeated. Okay, so we call the limbic system sometimes a pleasure center because sometimes there are behaviors that often result in quote-unquote pleasure. We call the limbic system the do-it-again system because when that system is activated, behaviors that activated that system are repeated. The limbic system, if we are technical in its name, we often say the mesolimbic system. And if we refer to the primary neurotransmitter dopamine that's involved in reward and reinforcement, we often refer to it as the mesolimbic dopamine system. Okay? So there are a few ways that we can refer to the limbic system. But again, pleasure is not necessary for behavior to be repeated. The only thing that's necessary for behavior to be repeated is activation of the limbic system. So sometimes there are things that people do and someone say, well, why'd you do that? And they say, I don't know. Okay. Sometimes it's because that behavior activated the limbic system. Okay. And so you can have the reinforcement without the sensation of quote unquote pleasure. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the decision to use drugs. We're going to talk about two things here that influence an individual's decision to use a drug. Okay? So the first thing we're going to talk about is the availability and value of natural reinforcers. Okay? The ordinary things that give us, I'm going to put that pleasure in quotations again. The ordinary things that give us pleasure, that we find reinforcing. Things like family, friends, relationships, jobs, educational opportunities, etc. Okay? So, how available, how easy is it to get those things? And do we value them? Okay? Why do I say that? Because it's just like that saying that you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So an individual could have lots of alternatives and things available to them, but if they don't value them, okay, then they could decide to use drugs. Okay? So the second thing is very much related. The first thing we're talking about the availability and value of natural reinforcers. And the second thing is the availability and the value that an individual places in drugs. Okay, so is it easy to get drugs, and how important are those drugs to that individual? Okay, and so really you want to combine these two things when we talk about the decision to use a drug, and part of what influences that, the availability and value of natural reinforcers versus the availability and value of drugs. Okay, so are these things available to me, natural reinforcers that I can find pleasure, quote unquote, in, and do I value them? Okay, oftentimes you'll see parents that enroll children in lots of after-school activities to try to keep them out of trouble, and even though all of those opportunities are available to the child, if they do not value them, you could have an individual that still makes a decision to partake of a drug. Okay? Similarly, you could have individuals that don't have all those opportunities available to them, but it doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily take a drug. Okay? So we have to probably dispel many of the stereotypes about who uses drugs and why. Okay? So it's about what's available to you and how do you value it. Are drugs easy to get and they're more important to me than the natural reinforcers I may have access to? Okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about something called the matching law. Okay? So when we talk about individuals trying to get drugs and the reinforcement that drugs might provide for an individual, what the matching law says is that an individual is going to match resources, what they're willing to invest in trying to get a drug, okay? They're going to match that to the expected reinforcement, okay? So, in other words, if I don't expect to get a great deal of reinforcement out of this drug, I may not invest much in it, much time, money into procuring that drug. But if it's something that I know is going to be a very big reinforcer, very powerful reinforcer, then the individual, may be more willing to invest a greater number of resources, etc. Okay? And I apologize, the second part, or bottom part of the slide is not necessarily related to the matching law, but we just want to talk about the relationship between drug reinforcers and non-drug reinforcers. And so what this is just trying to depict is that the more that an individual partakes of drugs, the more they're relying on drug reinforcers, then you diminish, okay, you have a diminished availability of non-drug reinforcers. Or another way of looking at that or saying that is a decreased ability to get reinforcement from non-drugs. So, in other words, if I'm sitting on the couch and I'm passed out drunk, then I obviously cannot enjoy the company of my family or my children, okay? So the more you partake of these drug reinforcers, then natural reinforcers are less available. You can't enjoy them if you're passed out, okay? Now we'll talk a little bit about drugs and non-drug reinforcers, from this perspective as well, that when we talk about individuals who are trying to discontinue their drug use, when you have decreased opportunities to obtain non-drug reinforcement, this is a situation that leaves an individual very vulnerable to relapse. So for example, if you think about the individuals who may not have a lot of friends or family left after their drug experience, because sometimes there are things that happen along that pathway to drug abuse that fractures relationships with friends and family, and sometimes those things and those relationships are very difficult to repair. And so when you think about individuals that don't have big support systems, maybe because of their drug use and legal issues that came about as a result of that, they can't find a job. Okay, so they have these decreased opportunities to obtain non-drug reinforcement, decreases opportunities to enjoy those natural reinforcers. Those set up situations that can lead to relapse. Okay, and then of course this is what we talked about on the previous slide in terms of the more often you partake of these drug reinforcers, you diminish the availability of non-drug reinforcers for yourself. Okay. The last thing we want to talk about in this small section is the fact that drugs differ in their ability to act as positive reinforcers. Okay? And the terms that we use to refer to this difference is abuse potential and abuse liability. Okay? So, all drugs don't have the same reinforcing ability. Some drugs may be more powerful reinforcers than others. And so if you're comparing two drugs, the greater reinforcer, or the one that provides the greater reinforcing effects, okay, is said to have the greater abuse potential or the greater abuse liability. An individual is more likely to abuse a drug that has a really high reinforcing ability. Okay, so if we go back to an example I think that I used with operant chambers, that if you gave an animal a choice, two drugs, drug A makes you say ooh, drug B makes you say ooh la la, okay, that drug ooh la la, drug B, would have the greater abuse potential, the greater abuse liability.